I've been writing music to some capacity for around 10 years now, just trying to get all of the musical ideas out of my head. I started in Sibelius. I used Sibelius for all of my music through high school, into college, until about a year or two before I graduated. You see, I found myself constantly frustrated at all of the little quirks and things that were slowing me down and just trying to get those ideas out of my head and onto the page. There were so many quirks with the software that just wasn't helping me out and was in fact just getting in my way. Its design was really convoluted, but it wasn't worse than Finale, I'll say that. I started using MuseScore a little bit in the beginning, but it wasn't nearly what it is now. Then I came across Dorico. I learned about the history of its creation, and as I learned more about the software, I started finding things that I realized I didn't even know I was missing. Features like condensing or being able to put together a percussion kit for a percussionist to play when they have several different instruments, that's brilliant. I'm just starting up my own publishing company to get my music out there, and I feel like Dorico is the software I want to have with me to join me on this journey. So today I wanted to talk about exactly why I switched to Dorico after so many years on Sibelius, and why you should consider it too. Firstly, let's talk about price. Dorico has 3 different versions: Dorico SE, Dorico Elements, and Dorico Pro. And they all come in at different price points. SE is free, Elements you pay a little bit more, and for Pro, you pay a real pro price for it, around $580. I didn't pay that much. I got it with the educational competitive cross-grade discount because I was using Sibelius and I was also in school, so I got it for much, much cheaper than that. The good thing is though, you keep that software forever. You aren't billed on a monthly basis or on a yearly basis to continue using the software. That was something that really was just bothering me about using Sibelius through Avid's subscription system. There's also an iPad version, which is very fully featured. It's missing a few things here and there, but I love having it on my iPad. In fact, when I first downloaded Dorico for the first time, I thought it would do wonderfully on the iPad, and apparently that was a part of their plan the entire time. You can pay like $4 a month to get all of the features for the iPad version, or you can just pay a one-time fee to have it for life. So that's cool. Now, one of my favorite things about Dorico is its philosophy behind the way it functions and the way it's designed. For example, something unique to Dorico that I really appreciate is the concept of flows. A flow is an intentionally abstractly named concept that lets you break down one single project into smaller bits. For example, if you have several cues for a film score, each one of those could be a flow. Or one flow could be the movement of a symphony, or a song in a songbook, etc. By the way, I'm going to be making a video on why I think Dorico is fantastic for film scoring, so stay subscribed for that. And in that same vein, no one from Dorico or Steinberg is asking me to make this video. These are really my thoughts. Steinberg, if you want to sponsor me, then we can talk, no problem. But no one is paying me to make this video and say good things. I just genuinely really like this software. I also love how focused the different modes are in Dorico. There are 5 modes that you can switch between when you're in a project: setup, write, engrave, play, and print. Let me give you a quick rundown. Setup mode is where you add all the instruments that you want, set up all the flows in your project, include layouts for the pages that each part is going to have, including combining which instruments you want in each flow and making custom layouts, like maybe you have a piano reduction for a choral part so that the choir can rehearse for a full orchestra performance or something like that. Write mode, this is the main tab where you do all of your composing. Everything associated with getting your music down on the page is in here. Engrave mode, this is the tab to focus on what your score looks like. This is purely graphical editing. So if you grab things and move them around, you're protected from making musical errors by accident on your score. It doesn't affect notation, it just affects graphics. That makes sense. Play mode is kind of like a DAW in the notation software. You can change how things play back. For example, you can change how dynamics play back, completely separate from how the notated score looks like. I don't spend a ton of time in here, although I do open the mixer from time to time to make sure that my things are balanced. Maybe I want to pan instruments a certain way. I might add my own reverb. And I occasionally go into play mode to change the dynamics lane from time to time if I feel like something is just a little bit too loud, but I don't want to change the dynamic on the page. Finally, print mode is for exporting your notated music at the very end. You can print directly to a printer, all kinds of options for that, or you can print to some kind of graphics file. I usually export it as a PDF often. In my publishing process, after I'm completely done in Dorico, I'll export as a PDF and import this into a dedicated publishing software to make an actual book out of it. In my case, I use Affinity Publisher. If you need to export audio or flows, you can do that under File, Export. Each mode also has an associated options dialog. Dorico is very options-based, which means you set up parameters beforehand or as you find that you need them for your project, and it'll apply it to the entire score as you need it. And then you can alter from individual cases from there. For example, in notation options, I set my drum set to be just one voice rather than split voices because that's just how I prefer it. And I also set this as my default so I don't have to change this every single time that I want to add a drum set part in my Dorico projects. All of the key commands are really logically laid out, which I appreciate as well. For example, in the popovers, Shift D for dynamics, Shift R for repeats, Shift K for key signatures, etc. Coming from Sibelius, a lot of these philosophies were a little confusing and took a little bit to adjust from the workflow from Sibelius to Dorico, but I got much faster in Dorico than I ever got in Sibelius. And that's thanks to the way the design was a consideration upfront in the creation of the software. And you'll understand why as I talk through different sections in this video. Now, composing is the most important thing that has to be right in a notation software. You need to be able to write the music down that you want to write. And I think Dorico's approach to this is very smart. The philosophy is this: being able to get your notes down quickly and easily and with ultimate flexibility to editing them after the fact. I'll show you what I mean. So let's talk about writing first. Note input is straightforward enough. You select your duration first, and then you can use either your QWERTY keyboard or a MIDI keyboard to input the notes that you want. Or you can hit K on your keyboard and do it the other way. You can select which notes you want first and then select the duration after that. I use this sometimes if I want to try out some maybe chords or voicings or something without having to commit to the actual notes on the page themselves. And then once I find something that I'm happy with, I'll just input the note as whatever I need it to be. The rhythm grid, I was a little apprehensive about at first. I wasn't sure that I liked it, but it really does make a lot of sense because I love how Dorico inputs the rests by itself without me having to add in the rests one by one. I feel like that's a silly waste of time unless I need something specifically done, and there are options for that too. But Dorico will put in rests automatically and will update the rests as you input notes to make the most notational sense. I also love how I can select adjacent staves and input notes to several staves at a time. I love how I can filter specific instruments to be shown, so I make sure that only related material is shown at a time. I love the pop-ups so I can quickly input related musical properties like dynamics, bar lines, time signatures, key signatures, etc., etc. So once you have your notes inputted, you likely want to go in and change things, update things, just make things better overall. That's part of the writing process. Things like adding notes in between music that you had previously is so convoluted in other softwares, but I love the way that Dorico handles this. Insert mode lets you input notes into a voice, a whole staff, or globally across your score. Everything will just move out of the way to make space for the notes that you're inputting in the middle, like a word processor does. How about creating common rhythms? Say you have some eighth notes that you want to change and to have a dotted eighth with a 16th note. You can select them all, hit the dot, and it'll update to make it that rhythm. If that isn't what you intended, then you can turn insert mode on and it'll just be explicitly what you asked it to do. If you want to change a series of notes, but you know you have the rhythm right, you can turn on lock to duration mode. Now you can press the new notes at your own pace and it'll update the old notes with your new notes and it won't affect the rhythm at all. That's wonderful. You can edit the duration of notes really easily as well with some really cool commands like this one to lengthen to next note. That one is incredibly useful. Another important design element that I think really shows off what Dorico's philosophy towards this is how the arrow keys function. This is completely different to Sibelius, but I think it makes so much more sense. So up, down, left, right lets you move the cursor around all the notes. Holding Option down while moving the arrow keys will actually move the notes themselves. Left to right rhythmically, up and down diatonically. Add the Shift key to the Option key with the arrow keys to lengthen the notes shorter or longer, or move the pitch up chromatically up and down. You can even press Command and Option and go up by an octave or down by an octave, etc. I use these functions all the time when inputting notes and of course when editing notes. Copying and pasting notes is really clever too. There are commands so you can copy notes to other staves or move notes to another stave. You can do this if you set up your own key commands. I have some set up because I just use these functions so much. Editing music in Dorico is like editing words in a word processor. And this is exactly what computers should be all about, facilitating the process of creation. It shouldn't be hindering the process in any way. It gets so frustrating to work in other softwares where you're just constantly battling to try and get the notes that you want in there. You can't edit like that on paper. It's just way more complicated that way. I find these functions invaluable. So next I want to talk about engraving and engraved mode. Dorico is very adamant about writing in write mode and graphical editing in engraved mode, and that those two are very separate parts of the process. You eliminate the possibility of musical errors when you're just focusing on how something looks, avoiding collisions here and there without accidentally grabbing a note and then changing its pitch, and you don't realize that when you're just focusing on what it's going to look like when you print it out or give it to players. I really adore the music font that was created for this, Bravura. Bravura is just thick in all the right places. It's a little bolder than the default fonts in Sibelius and Finale, and I appreciate the control that I have over options. In engraving options, global preferences are very nitpicky, which can be useful if you need to access these and change them at any point. I would spend time in here just browsing through what you can change because you might prefer, say, your chord symbols to look a certain way. I usually will go in here to change to jazz standard chord symbols because I write jazz music and I usually don't need the other styles of the chord symbols. In here, you can make system breaks and page breaks. Dorico calls them frame breaks. You can also nudge staff spacing and horizontal spacing if you need to. Under the library menu, not only can you change all of the options related to maybe the fonts that you're using in your score or the way that certain aspects look, as well as accessing all of the options dialogues. You can also open the library manager so you can import options from another project into the project that you're working on now, so you can be sure you have a consistent house style across all of your scores. I find this super helpful as I'm developing my own kind of house style for my own publishing company. I've also become accustomed to working with page templates. For example, adding the title, subtitle, composer, that kind of information onto a page and then setting it as a template that every part uses from then on. All I have to do is input that information in the project info dialog, and it'll update across all the parts through all the templates automatically. This is the advantage of using these templates and what Dorico calls tokens, which are these little bits of script that will just update automatically as you input project info. This can be a little confusing to get a grasp on at first, but it does make a lot of sense. Most of my time in engraved mode is altering page templates and such, but at the very, very end of my process, I will alter maybe how many bars or staves there are in a page for page turns and stuff like that. I'll also make little tiny adjustments for certain things like the positions of dynamics for the sake of how things are laid out on a page and preventing things from getting too close to each other, like collisions and such. But I will reiterate that Dorico does this all very, very well automatically on its own. And I would not do this stuff until after you're done composing, well, as done as you can allow yourself to be. Since graphical editing is so explicitly different from notational editing, once you move something on the page and then you make another edit, what you moved will still stay there, even though notationally you moved it to another place. So you might have to reset its position and then change something again after you notate. So that's the software side. But another big part of the software and why I enjoyed so much is just the support and the community around it. A software like this is just prone to complexity and things will go wrong. Just because functions get so complex, projects get so complex, the software is so complex, things will naturally go wrong. You can bet on that for sure. Murphy's Law. Or maybe they're just things that you don't understand or functions you don't know where to find. And this is where all of Dorico's resources come into play in a big part here. I have the Dorico online manual bookmarked because honestly, I just like reading through it and learning everything I can about the software so that I can utilize it better in my own creative writing. It's so comprehensive. Every bit of the software is in there, complete with screenshots and links to videos and all that kind of thing. The YouTube channel is very comprehensive and helpful. They have tons of videos. There's also an official forum where the Dorico staff is very, very active and actively participating in. I like roaming through there really often. The Dorico Facebook group is very helpful. And not only that, the people who use Dorico love using Dorico, and they want other people to love using Dorico too. And they're so helpful in letting other people know what they can or maybe can't do in Dorico. So that's a big part of why I love it. So lastly, it's not all rainbows and butterflies. I do have gripes with the software. Now, Sibelius and Finale were created a long time ago, which means they had a lot of time to mature as software and subsequently become bloated, but also just to introduce their features. Dorico was launched in 2016, so it's relatively very, very young and just frankly doesn't have everything yet. That being said, every time Dorico introduces a new feature, they implement it 10 times better than any other software has. So that's a big part of the reason why I can forgive so many of the things that are just missing in Dorico, because I know that they're coming, and I know that when they do come, they're going to be so well thought out, laid out, everything like that. So I have absolutely no problem with features being implemented intelligently and properly, but I just can't help myself with this gripe list. So firstly, I understand why Dorico treats tied notes as one single note, but this can cause some problems, especially when I try to write for percussion, which I do a lot. This can be difficult when I want to add tremolo slashes to a snare drum roll, for example, because a snare drum roll has to stop at a certain point. That last note is known as a release. If it's accented, then you explicitly make that last note sound. If it's not accented, then you just stop the roll at that point. But it's not helpful when Dorico just continues the roll to the last note that's also rolled. That isn't what I want. And then adding the accent, I understand that as being the beginning of a note. You generally won't accent the end of a note if you're a wind player, but on the snare drum, you might want to accent that release note. So I have to be able to have full control of that without having to go into the engrave mode into the properties panel to move the accent from the first note to the last note. It's just that for something I do that often, there needs to be a workaround for that. Dorico can also get pretty sluggish on really large projects, and I understand why. Dorico is making so many calculations under the hood, spacing this out here, spacing that note here, across all layouts, across all scores, intelligently, immediately, as you're inputting notes in real time. The issue is that when you get to the end of a large project, inputting a note can take a couple of seconds to register, or at least pop up, because Dorico is calculating everything first before it introduces the notes, and then everything will happen. I just wish the perceived performance was a little bit higher in this regard. Maybe graphically things happen immediately and then everything is loading in the background. For example, jumping between write mode and engrave mode sometimes will take a little bit of lag because Dorico is making all of those things appear. Maybe if you have something selected, when you switch to engrave mode, you still see that thing selected, but in the background, Dorico is still thinking about adding all of those engraved things. Just graphically, it's immediate. Everything is loading in the background subsequently, rather than everything loading, then you end up in engraved mode. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making myself clear here. Dorico is awesome for typical tonal music, and there are some cool features that you can utilize in making your own art music and things like that. You can set your own tonal system. You can create your own accidentals and set certain pitch ranges to that. That's great for the really microtonal type of writing. But if you want to do like Penderecki or Lutosławski's style cutaway score type writing, there are so many workarounds that you have to do in order to make that happen. I recently wrote a symphony, more on that in a later video. But in my symphony, there's like a 10 to 20 second part where it's just atonal. I put notes in a little box and then the player just has to ad-lib on those notes for a set period of time. That was difficult to put together, and especially difficult concerning condensing and the way it looked in parts and things like that. It was just a hassle to write in that style, and I usually don't write in that style, so I can't imagine what it's like for somebody who writes that kind of music often. I look forward to when the team at Dorico can figure out a good solution to this and can get it out to us. All of that being said, I really do believe that Dorico is the future of music notation. The staff is so responsive on Dorico outlets. The Dorico community is so passionate about it. If you ever need help, you can bet that you can find it really, really easily. Not all features are in Dorico yet, but the way they implement features is just so smart and thoughtful. I have no problem using Dorico only for my composing, arranging, scoring, engraving, everything for the foreseeable future. Entrusting it with my work and my career, and I hope that you consider it too. So until next time, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Ernesto Composer. You can visit my Patreon at patreon.com/Ernesto Composer. You can get access to templates like Dorico templates that I use myself, score study versions of my published works, Score Study Sunday hangouts every single month, and more goodies. You can visit my website at ernestocomposer.com. Thanks so very much for watching. As always, take care.